WWE used to build characters that felt memorable and larger than life. The Undertaker was a supernatural dead man who commanded fear and respect every time the lights went out. John Cena was the never-give-up superhero who fought against impossible odds and inspired millions of kids worldwide. Stone Cold Steve Austin was the beer-drinking rebel who represented every working person sick of their boss. Jeff Hardy was the risk-taking enigma who wasn't afraid to put his body on the line. These weren't just ordinary people performing moves in a ring. They were fully fleshed-out characters with clear motivations, backstories, consistent personalities, and story arcs that made every punch matter. There were clear good guys you could root for and obvious bad guys you could root against. That dynamic is what made wrestling special. You weren't just watching people doing flips and holds, you were watching stories unfold with heroes and villains, betrayals and redemptions, triumph and tragedy. But today, if you look at the current WWE roster, you can barely tell who's supposed to be a face and who's supposed to be a heel. There are no clear character motivations, no consistent personalities, and wrestlers flip between being good and bad with barely any explanation just for the sake of shock value. The lines have become blurred to the point where characters feel generic and forgettable. So what caused this dramatic change? What are the core differences between how WWE used to build characters during its peak versus the bland gimmicks we see today? How is this killing WWE's magic and how can it be fixed? Let's find out. To understand what truly went wrong with WWE's portrayal of characters, we need to take a brief look at the history of how wrestling gimmicks evolved over the decades. In the golden era of the 1980s, wrestlers were jacked, massive specimens who looked like comic book superheroes come to life. You had guys like the $1 Million Man who immediately gave off rich jerk vibes. You had Macho Man Randy Savage. You had Roddy Piper. You had Honky Tonk Man. And even if a character or gimmick wasn't perfectly executed, these guys looked larger than life and made them stand out from regular people on the street. Hulk Hogan didn't just play a hero, he looked like one. The Ultimate Warrior looked like someone from a different planet. The physiques themselves told a story before anyone even grabbed a microphone. Then the steroid trial happened in the early 1990s, and WWE had to clean up their public image. The company shifted away from the bodybuilder aesthetic towards lighter, faster-paced wrestling, and guys like Shawn Michaels and Bret Hart took the spotlight as the faces of the new generation. But even these smaller, more technical wrestlers understood the fundamental importance of character work. Shawn Michaels wasn't just a great in-ring performer. He was a narcissistic prick who was arrogant, but always backed up that arrogance in the ring. Along with DX, he pushed boundaries, broke rules, and cemented his position at the top of WWE. However, the new generation era wasn't drawing the numbers WWE wanted. This clearly revealed what happens when you shift away from larger-than-life characters and present wrestlers as regular people. WWE's biggest star, Hulk Hogan, had signed with rival WCW, and the Monday Night Wars began. WWE was getting destroyed in the ratings week after week, and Vince McMahon had to adapt quickly or watch his company die. They couldn't lean into the bodybuilder look anymore due to the steroid scandal, so they leaned more heavily towards characters and gimmicks that would hook audiences worldwide. That's when the character of Stone Cold Steve Austin was born. Austin was the blue-collar anti-hero who refused to play by anyone's rules and took what he wanted through his rebellious attitude. His biggest foe was Vince McMahon himself, the power-hungry evil boss who represented everything wrong with the system. The roles were crystal clear, and the lines were sharply defined between hero and villain. This Vince versus Austin saga carried WWE through their hottest period in company history, the Attitude Era, where wrestling became mainstream once again. When Austin turned heel and joined forces with Vince at WrestleMania 17, it marked the beginning of the end for wrestling's hottest period because the characters once again strayed from their core identity. John Cena has a famous quote where he says, "You should be able to describe your character with one word." When you look at Cena, the word is Superman. For Undertaker, the word is Dead Man. For Dolph Ziggler, the word is Show-Off. For Kane, the word is Monster. For Austin, it was Rebel. Wrestlers may add layers, nuances, and depth on top of this character foundation, but the core remains solid and consistent. When Austin joined Vince and stepped away from the core Rebel identity that made him special, it marked the moment when WWE started losing touch with what made their characters connect with the audience. But even after the Attitude Era ended, throughout the Ruthless Aggression Era, WWE still had solid characters with clear motivations and consistent cores. Randy Orton was the legend killer who targeted veterans and icons to carve his own legacy. Batista was an unstoppable monster who broke out from Evolution and dominated everyone in his path through raw power. John Cena was the superhero who overcame every obstacle and never quit no matter how tough the challenge got. Edge was the cunning mastermind who used mind games and dirty tricks to get to the top. The core consistency of these characters was the driving force that made audiences genuinely care about them. When you knew exactly who someone was and what they stood for, you could invest in their journey emotionally. That's what modern WWE has completely lost. And this brings us to the heart of the problem. Going back to Cena's one-word philosophy of character building, if you take someone like The Undertaker, the character evolved dramatically over his career. He went from a zombie mortician controlled by Paul Bearer to the leader of the Ministry of Darkness, to the American badass biker, and back to the undead phenom. But throughout all these transformations, the core remained mostly consistent. He was always the ominous, supernatural force who commanded respect and struck fear into his opponents. That's what made him captivating. That's what made him a legend. Each evolution built upon the previous version rather than contradicting it or pretending it never existed. Now, if you compare that to someone like Austin Theory from today's roster, there is no consistency whatsoever. He started as part of Seth Rollins' faction as a young disciple learning from a veteran. Then he became Vince McMahon's golden boy, taking selfies and acting like an entitled brat. Then he got paired into a tag team with Grayson Waller, and now he's part of the Vision story with completely different mannerisms and presentation. There is no solid, consistent core to build from. Each evolution of the character feels completely detached from the previous iteration instead of building on top of it. Theory goes from storyline to storyline with no character development, no clear motivation, and no personality that audiences can latch onto. He's whoever the writers need him to be that particular month. Heck, even the most well-written characters in the modern era fail to maintain consistency. Take Drew McIntyre, for example. He was one of the hottest things on the card throughout 2023 and 2024. He was the bloodline hunter, feuding with Roman Reigns and the Usos. Every time he was about to capture the title, he would get screwed over by the bloodline's numbers game, which gave him sympathy and made his actions feel justified. Even after pivoting away from the bloodline storyline, he transitioned into a heated personal feud with CM Punk that made perfect sense for his character. The core foundation of his persona as someone who was justified in his anger, someone who felt wronged by the system and was constantly overlooked despite his talent, still remained intact. But then in 2025, he was suddenly transformed into a whiny, crying heel that completely deviated from the core of his character. He went from a badass Scottish warrior seeking vengeance to nothing more than a punching bag for Cody Rhodes. That shift took away all the edge and intensity from his character that made audiences connect with him in the first place. Even when he won the WWE title on SmackDown, it felt anticlimactic and made him look weak. WWE just needed a heel champion for Sami Zayn to face at Saudi for the Royal Rumble, and most likely, Drew is going to drop the title back to Cody after the Rumble, probably at Elimination Chamber. And speaking of Cody, the core of his character when he returned to WWE was crystal clear. He was the guy who wanted to win the world title his father Dusty Rhodes never captured. He was the chaser, the prodigal son who left WWE, rebuilt himself on the independent scene, and then came back to prove he belonged at the top and finish the story. That narrative carried him through 2 WrestleManias and created some of the most emotional moments in recent WWE history. Once that chapter of his character concluded at WrestleMania 40, when he finally finished his story by defeating Roman Reigns, it was time to pivot to something fresh and add new dimensions to keep the character interesting. They could have added layers to his persona, maybe turned him heel and painted him as an arrogant champion who believed he was above everyone else now that he achieved his goal. At the core, he would have still remained the son of Dusty trying to honor his father's legacy, but it would have added a new dimension and created fresh storytelling opportunities. He could have become the corporate champion similar to how The Rock transformed in the Attitude Era. Meanwhile, Drew McIntyre could have evolved into the authority-defying rebel character like Stone Cold Steve Austin with a double turn. This one simple change alone could have made WWE exciting again and opened the gates for new compelling feuds and segments reminiscent of the legendary Rock vs. Austin rivalry. The story writes itself, but instead of pulling the trigger, WWE plays it safe. They keep Cody as the bland, smiling babyface for the sponsors and advertisers. They're so terrified of making the wrong move that they end up making no moves at all. And a lot of this has to do with how the fundamental nature of pro wrestling has changed in the modern era. Back in the Attitude Era, and even during the Ruthless Aggression period, kayfabe was still somewhat protected. Wrestlers stayed in character during public appearances and interviews. When Undertaker showed up on an interview, he was still the dead man. When The Rock did press for his movies, he still carried that electrifying charisma and larger-than-life persona. The line between performer and character remained blurred enough that audiences could suspend disbelief and stay invested in the storylines. But today, that line has been completely erased. Social media platforms have given fans behind-the-scenes access to wrestlers' real lives and personalities. Wrestlers post about their families, their hobbies, and their genuine friendships with people they're supposed to be feuding with on television. You'll see two wrestlers having a grueling match on Monday Night Raw, and then by Tuesday morning, they're posting Instagram stories together at the gym or doing a podcast together. This constant breaking of kayfabe makes it nearly impossible for audiences to take storylines seriously or invest emotionally in the characters. The explosion of wrestling podcasts has made this problem even worse. When you hear Kevin Owens and Cody Rhodes on a podcast talking about the creative ideas for their feud, it becomes impossible to separate the real person from the character. The mystique and immersion that made wrestling special has been completely stripped away. WWE themselves have contributed to this problem by leaning heavily into meta storytelling and shows like WWE Unreal. When Michael Cole is talking about what's trending on X during a supposed heated feud, it takes you completely out of the moment and reminds you that this is all just content designed to generate engagement. The company has also become obsessed with making their wrestlers relatable rather than aspirational. While this creates a different kind of connection with audiences, it fundamentally undermines the ability to create iconic, mythical characters like The Undertaker or Kane. Imagine The Undertaker posting TikToks about his morning coffee routine, or Kane tweeting about his favorite TV shows during the Attitude Era. The mystique would have been destroyed instantly. The harsh truth is that WWE has forgotten the fundamental principle that made their characters legendary in the first place. You need a solid, clearly defined core that remains consistent even as the character evolves and adds layers over time. Modern WWE strips away that core consistency in favor of whatever serves the immediate storyline needs, whatever generates the most social media buzz that week, or whatever keeps sponsors and advertisers happy. They're more concerned with generating Twitter retweets, YouTube views, and viral TikTok moments than crafting long-term character arcs that build stars. This short-term thinking means characters never get the time and consistency needed to truly develop and connect with audiences on a deeper level. When everything can change on a whim with no explanation, nothing matters. Audiences stop caring because they know whatever emotional investment they make today will likely be retconned tomorrow. Unless WWE rediscovers the importance of character consistency and long-term storytelling, they'll continue producing gymnasts and social media influencers instead of stars. They'll continue having talented performers who can work amazing matches but can't connect with the audience on a personal level. Until that lesson is relearned, WWE's character work will remain a pale shadow of what it once was during wrestling's greatest era. And speaking of the greatest era, check out this video next to relive the greatest era of WWE in its entirety.